Welcome to Mexico Matters, the CSIS podcast about how events occurring in Mexico can impact and, more importantly, matter in the United States. I am Mariana, non-resident senior associate of the Americas program at CSIS and the former CEO of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. As the United States and China engage in a superpower competition, the world is also experiencing wars, conflicts, populism, climate change, and many other challenges that together or separately could derail the world order as we know it. To talk to us about how the United States can or should deal with all of these issues and at the same time focusing in running its own race and in making sure that its own backyard does not add another problem, that it is truly my privilege to welcome General David Petraeus, former director of the CIA and a retired Army general, partner of KKR, and chairman of the KKR Global Institute. General Petros, it is such an honor to have you back in Mexico Matters.
Thanks, Mariana. Good to see you.
3 years ago, time flies. We were in the midst of the pandemic when we last spoke. So a lot of things have happened since then. Mexico has a new president. The U.S. is less than 100 days from its presidential election. We have hot wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and a lot of other conflicts that are spinning around the world. In fact, conflict is the title of your most recent book. General, as a former CIA director, as a retired Army general, and as a partner in a global investment firm, what is your number one concern for the United States from a security and an economic perspective right now?
Well, perhaps I could have two.
You can have as many as you want.
First is that we and our allies and partners together are having to keep more plates spinning simultaneously, some of which are more complex than in many decades, than at least since the end of the Cold War, maybe even, in fact, since the end of World War II. These plates represent the challenges that we face, the threats in a whole variety of different ways. And again, we have to keep all of them going to the best of our ability, noting that there is one that is far more important than all the others put together, and that is the U.S. and Western relationship with China. And that would be the second, if you will. It's all China all the time. So much of what is going on does hinge on that crucial relationship. And let me just state up front, I would like to see that relationship be as absolutely mutually beneficial as is possible. But you learn as the director of the CIA to deal with the world the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be. And the way it is has become more challenging with respect to, again, the U.S. and Western relationship to China over recent years, even just in the last 3 years, although there were already trends when we last talked that were quite ominous and quite concerning. That's the biggest of the plates. Again, we have to do everything we can to keep it from even wobbling. Deterrence in the Indo-Pacific has to be rock solid, or actions we have to take in regard to that. But there's a number of other plates that we have to keep spinning. There's the much more menacing and dangerous Russia plate with an unprovoked, brutal invasion, of course, that has taken place again over the last 3 years. There's still a North Korean nuclear weapons plate. There is an Iran plate that maybe it's 3 plates, actually. There is an Iran nuclear program, not yet a weapon, but again, very concerning, closest to it ever. There is an Iran plate that represents the drones and the missile threats that they pose, and they're providing those, of course, to Russia, along with assistance that North Korea is providing to Russia, and also China in the form of components that are necessary for the construction of weapon systems and materiel. And then there's a third Iran-related plate, which is its support to malign actors in the region, as the term goes. That's Hamas, obviously, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, Shia militia in Iraq and Syria, trying to Lebanonize Iraq, in fact. And then the Houthis in Yemen that have caused such problems in the Red Sea and cost Egypt some 80% of the revenue they would normally get through the Suez Canal requiring ships in many respects to go around Africa rather than through the Suez. Cost ship owners more for that, obviously, insurance, and then also challenges with containers that are being used for longer than they otherwise would have been. There are still plates that represent individual Islamist extremist groups, some of which are much more worrisome. The Islamic State Khorasan group centered on Afghanistan, but throughout the entire region, which of course carried out the horrific attack at an opera house in Moscow and has also sought to carry out attacks elsewhere. There is the Islamic State remnant still in Iraq and in Syria. We have to keep an eye and pressure on them because we learned the hard way what happens if we don't. There are Islamist extremists in East Africa, North Africa, Western Africa, and other locations around the world. There are increased and ever more diabolically clever cyber threats, nation state criminals, extremists, you name it, with different objectives in mind, but employing artificial intelligence very, very creatively and in a very threatening manner. There are challenges from climate change, essentially, the manifestations of climate change, fires that are worse than ever. The storm of the century is now the storm of every other year. The flooding, desertification of the Sahel, which has forced millions of individuals to move from there and then push into even Europe. So again, I can keep on going.
Yeah.
Domestic populism would be another one. And of course, Mexico is certainly seen the effects of that as Lopez Obrador is being succeeded by his chosen successor, who by and large, I think, our cabinet, I think, is impressive. But very likely to continue the thrust of his programs. And we're not done with him yet. He's going to have one last push, of course, to try to neutralize the judicial with judicial reform, which would be a real blow to one of the last independent institutions and checks and balances in that country. Many, many plates that are out there. The big challenge is keeping all of them going. But within that, there is one that matters more than all the rest. And that is, again, the relationship with China.
General, it is certainly a very, very challenging world. I mean, it is so complicated. How can the United States, or do you believe the United States, can keep, to continue your analogy, spinning all these plates and at the same time focus on strengthening its own competitiveness to allow the United States to continue to win that race, right? And to maintain its leadership position around the world? The world needs the United States.
I think it is doable. It requires great leadership. By and large, I think we have generally done that. There have been, I think, some huge mistakes, actually, the withdrawal from Afghanistan that we could have continued. We had a sustainable situation in terms of the expenditure of blood and treasure. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months. The amount of money was modest. We had 3 times the coalition partners on the ground and so forth. Yes, it was not what we hoped it would be. It was frustrating. Our partners on the ground in Kabul were maddening at times. There was deterioration in the security situation, but Taliban controlled no major urban area, and we could have kept it that way. I felt that that would be a mistake. I said publicly that we will come to regret the decision to withdraw, which of course was taken by the previous administration and then implemented by this one, and that the situation that would follow was very likely to be much, much worse. And sadly, I think that has borne out. But in a number of other cases, I think we have led the world in ways that has been very important. On China, for example, there's bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill about the need to be firmer with China. And that is certainly the case. And there's continuity from the previous administration, which changed the conversation on China, as you know, to this one, which continued that, made it more comprehensive, albeit with the absence of one huge component in that comprehensive integrated whole of governments, and S on the end, all of our partners together. And that's the absence of a trade component, which is just not feasible given the domestic politics in the United States, sadly. But again, I think we can do this. I think we have to do this. And I think we should do it. This is in our cold, hard national interest. This is not charity. What we're doing to help Ukraine is not, again, some charitable notion. This is to prevent a country from having its independence eliminated, after which Russia would continue. They'll go to Moldova next, then they'd go to Lithuania, all of which would be catastrophic. So again, we need to enable Ukraine with everything that we can together with our allies and partners. Here, it's notable that the Europeans have actually, in aggregate, provided more total humanitarian, economic, and security assistance than we have, while we have certainly led the way in the category of security assistance. And done so, I think, very impressively, albeit with some slow decisions, unnecessarily slow decisions on certain key weapon systems and policies, but
Right.
nonetheless led that overall effort. So again, I think we need to do this because this is in our national interest. It's not that we're doing it again just for some charitable or high-minded reason. It's again realistic assessment of the global situation and our position in it and the benefits that we enjoy because of the perpetuation of the so-called rules-based international order.
Yeah. And that world order certainly has been benefiting not only the United States, but the whole world, including China.
Well, certainly all of the allies and
Yeah.
partners who share our beliefs. There are
Correct.
others, obviously, that would like to make the world safe for authoritarianism or for other forms of government that would be more discriminatory, other forms of economic policy, et cetera, et cetera. And they'd like to undermine the rules based international order that we and our allies in the wake of World War II established to try to prevent the recurrence of the three horrific events that were in the first 45 years of the previous century, which were two Cold Wars and the Great Depression.
Correct. When we see the world general and we bring the conversation down to North America, to our neighborhood, I mean, it's really incredible how geography has blessed us, right? I mean, we're not in the midst of all of these conflicts and have not been. And you have been a very important voice in favor of deeper North American integration. You wrote a report a few years ago with Bob Zoellick advocating for this notion. Today, after everything we've seen, you talked a little bit about Lopez Obrador and populism, and you've had, your share as well. Do you still believe North American integration is in the interest of the United States? Further North American
Sure.
integration?
Absolutely. And I believe it's in the interest of the three countries of North America.
Completely.
The problem is that the aspirations that we had for the Mexican component of North American integration during the Peña Nieto, the first 2 years, which is when Bob Zoellick and I were doing that Council on Foreign Relations study on North America, those aspirations were not sustainable. As you'll recall, he ran into some real challenges in his third year after doing the very impressive constitutional reforms, which were all aimed at improving productivity for Mexican workers in a whole host of comprehensive way, as you'll recall, financial reform, economic reform, judicial reform, education,
Energy reform.
energy, big time energy, which has been undone, been reversed, of course, by the current administration. Also, a variety of others, telecoms, which actually was implemented and did benefit. All that was done. The implementing legislation was done in the second year. That's when we finalized the report. There were real reasons for optimism at the time. And then the wheels came off the bus of that administration. They struggled for several years. That brought about calls for populism. AMLO has very effectively fed that and been reversing some of the very, very important reforms and trying to undermine, again, the institutions of Mexico that have often provided the checks and balances in the same way that our institutions do in the United States. And the security situation has gotten further out of control. And that is hugely challenging. You know very well that something like 5% of all cases actually are prosecuted effectively. And
Or less.
most cases aren't even brought because there's no real confidence in the judicial. There's three legs to the rule of law stool. It's the security leg, if you will, normally police, but here it involves the armed forces as well. The judicial leg and the prison or penitentiary leg. If one of those is weak, the stool can wobble and fall over. In this case, I would submit that all three are weak in various degrees and in various ways in the various states. This is not to say that you can't do great business in Monterrey, the manufacturing hub, really in some ways, of North America, or Mexico City or some others. But there are growing challenges. We're investors in Mexico. I originated the first deal. It was done with Pemex. Done a number since then. It's gotten very, very difficult. And so it's not just the old run of the mill corruption, if you will. There's real security erosion, which means that the writ of the states and of the federal system have lost control in some of these areas. And that is very worrisome. So that is, I think, something that tempers very much observations about the prospects. And frankly, it means that Mexico is not able to take the advantage of incredible dynamics, big trends right now that favor Mexico. Mexican
Okay.
labor costs right now are lower than those in China in some sectors. Mexican labor is very good. Obviously, it's right next door. So nearshoring is a huge theme.
Huge opportunity.
Friendshoring. If you don't like what's coming out of the supply chain elsewhere in the world, we generally trust what comes out of Mexico. So again, there are huge advantages. It is obviously on the doorstep of the largest economy in the world, has free access to it, et cetera, et cetera. And there should be probably double the amount of outside investment, double the growth in Mexico if you had greater rule of law and greater confidence in the situation there, including in government decisions. And that unfortunately is not the case.
Yeah, completely. And you mentioned briefly, but if that judicial reform is passed in the month of September, then sort of the prospects for attracting any investments, I think, are going to be really, really tough. And moreover, some of this legal framework that exists today in Mexico is part of the USMCA. So we would be actually at risk of being in violation of USMCA. So you add another complication to a very complicated scenario already.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
and there's other issues that are arising that have challenges in terms of USMCA as well that will come to. And
exactly.
some of these are to be expected. Now the challenge is also with China investing in Mexico, trying to build in Mexico to get access, but then there's going to be content laws that will be at issue and so forth. So there's a number of points of friction. Some of these, again, always to be expected. We even have some of these with our fellow NATO member, Canada, when it comes to certain industries. We've
Yeah.
generally been able to work through them, but some of these could be very serious. And more important, again, it's not just the effect on USMCA, it is what you note, which is the effect on enthusiasm of investors.
Mhm.
We're already concerned by a number of the developments there. Again, keep in mind these are not just narco trafficantes anymore. These are criminal empires, and they're
Completely.
engaged in every form of criminal activity, constantly trying to expand. They have to do that. Again, they are like empires traditionally. They run into other criminal organizations. You have huge battles over this. But again, if you're in an area controlled by them, your business is going to pay them 10 or 15% for the privilege of staying in business, or else there might be a fire at your place that night. So again, this is very, very concerning and was nowhere as bad as back when Bob Zellick and I were so enthusiastic about the prospects for the Mexican component of North America
Yeah.
has the situation now.
Completely. No, I mean, it's really, really worrisome. And as you say, I mean, organized crime is not only engaged in illegal activities, but they're little by little sort of co-opting or getting into legal, regular legal activities. So according to the US military, I think a third of Mexico's territory is already controlled by organized crime. And you see reports that is even greater than that. General, what is the biggest concern in your mind about this security situation, and how can it impact the United States? Forget about how can it impact Mexico, because we already sort of said that Mexico might lose the opportunity of nearshoring if we don't control the situation. But what is the impact for the United States from a security perspective?
Well, it's very serious. There's a number of components of this. One is it's exporting, of course, fentanyl in very, very large quantities, which is the biggest source of death right now in the United States.
Mm.
It's a huge issue. Yes, I know the Mexican argument that we're the customers. It's because we're buying it. Our weapons are fueling it, and this kind of stuff. And there is certainly truth to that. We all need to do a better job, but that is a huge, huge issue. And then the infrastructure of this actually is going north of the border as well. So then you have criminal activity in the United States, and that's problematic in the gangs and et cetera in some of our cities and so forth. The other issue, though, is again that we're missing this enormous opportunity for North America writ large and for Mexico in particular to take advantage of these extraordinary trends and developments around the world. I mentioned again, nearshoring, again, lower labor costs, friendshoring, the opportunity to take advantage of
U.S.
distrust supply chain and all the rest of that. So again, these are massive developments.
Yeah.
They're huge trends. Mexico is benefiting from them.
But not as much as we could. Yeah,
That's exactly right. I mean, I'd say they'd be growing twice as much. The
completely.
challenge, of course, is that a Mexican president has 6 years. By the time he or she actually recognizes the magnitude of the threat, there's only 4 years left or so. And then to realize the kind of resources that would be necessary to actually combat this threat, and the knowledge that it gets much worse before it gets better. This is not unlike, the surge in Iraq, where I told Congress, look, we're going to take this on. We have to drive violence down. But to do that, we're going to have to go into the areas and take them away from the bad guys. You do it in a sequential way and so forth. But they're going to fight you back, and it's going to be bloody. And as the situation has continued to metastasize, not unlike cancer, it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
It gets more and more challenging, and presidents shrink from this. I remember one president who will name nameless, but he asked me to come down to see him before he left office because we'd had some very, very important joint operations when I was last in government, and proudly pointed out that they had trained 25,000 federal police on his watch. And I said, that is indeed a very impressive achievement. By my calculations, you only need another 225,000. That's the man. Now, you don't have to do it all at once. And that was a little bit for shock effect, but
Wow. Yeah.
do it all at once. You should do it. Look at what Monterrey did.
Yeah.
May need to do again.
Yeah, exactly.
How they did that. And that can be a model for elsewhere. Yes, elsewhere doesn't have the resources that they have there. Yes, it's a different situation, but it's not completely dissimilar. And that's what needs to be done. It's the oil blot, the ink spot, whatever you want to call it. And you just keep expanding it and going into another area and so forth. But it's very, very challenging. And the longer Mexico waits to confront these situations, the worse it gets and the tougher it is. So that's very, very concerning. And of course, then you also have part of these gangs' activities, these criminal empires, is enabling illegal immigration into the United States. So you basically have people smugglers. And some of these people, unfortunately, now are real security threats to the US. So that's yet another concern, along with just the sheer number of people that are coming across, enabled again by these gangs. Although recent policies in Washington and also in Mexico City have really quite dramatically reduced the flow of individuals across the border.
General, a few days ago, there were two high ranking leaders of the Sinaloa cartel surrendered to US authorities. A lot of people believe that by capturing, the heads of these cartels, that you actually have a blow and you reduce their power. Other people say that, because the organization is well and thriving, that if you remove the heads, it's actually more complicated because there can be in wars or wars between one and the other one. Are you optimistic that by removing, two members of the Sinaloa cartel, the situation or the flow of fentanyl into the United States will be reduced?
Well, what this really highlights, this debate, neither side is right. They're both right to a degree. This is one of those cases where the truth is not to be found in one view or the other, but in the conversation between them. And both are required. Again, what we did in the surge in Iraq was we went after the leaders, but we also took away the territory from the organizations themselves and even reconciled with the low level individuals. You bring them in from the cold, you provide them an alternative to a life of extremism and insurgency. So it takes all of the above. And then it takes, again, it's not just military at all. This takes civil military, where you've got to then, again, provide alternative jobs, education, opportunity, so they don't feel that their only choice in life is to engage in criminal activity as part of this organization that somehow has sucked them into its orbit. And that is, again, very, very challenging. But the mindset, the campaign plan for this, or the strategy, is most similar to that of a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, where the insurgents are not political insurgents, say communists or something like that, say in Southeast Asia, or Islamist extremists, as in some of the Middle East scenarios with Al Qaeda and then the Islamic State. They are criminal in nature. And it requires the same kind of approach. And if you look at what was done in Monterrey about probably 12, 15 years ago and sustained pretty impressively until the recent times, and you will understand this well, I know, that was textbook counterinsurgency. They reformed the entire police. They fired the whole police force, as I recall.
Yeah, and they started from zero. Yeah.
And paid them twice as much. They put them in protected housing. Their families could go to protected schools. They overhauled the judicial component there, and they also fixed the prison system by and large. And then they largely preserved this with a lot of good intelligence and security activities. But it has eroded even there in recent years. And I was there just, I guess, a year or so ago and met with, again, the gang of, now it's, I think, the gang of 12. I think they've expanded a bit.
Right.
And they share the concern that I have. And they're examining what it is that they can do. I mean, the preferred method would be, and this is what was proposed to President Peña Nieto, expand it to the entire state of Nuevo Leon. You have a great ink blot, an oil spot, an area of good security. The same was true of Tijuana at that time, was really quite good. And you could understand why it was. There was really good police leadership. His family was in California, didn't feel threatened, was taking them on and just pushing them down. Again, that's the kind of approach that is required, but it is very hard. And you have to set up the structures properly so that families aren't vulnerable, individuals aren't vulnerable, and the rest of it, which is, of course, why the federal police was such an important initiative back in that day, but just didn't expand to the size that was necessary for the kind of campaign that was required even then.
And General, in addition to the political will that is needed to do something like that in Mexico, I assume that Mexico doesn't have the resources, nor the intelligence, nor the capabilities to really do it alone if we are to take some of the territory back, right? I mean, we need the United States. Mexico will need the US cooperation. Are you optimistic that the new Claudia Sheinbaum administration will be willing to cooperate with the United States in these regards, in addition to any others? But, when we talk about just security, can we rebuild trust?
I am honestly not sure. This has gone up and down over the years. There have been periods of very good. And of course, part of the challenge has been that when you change from one party to another, all that resident memory and the relationships and all the rest of that end, and it has to be rebuilt. And it takes a year or two just for a new president, especially if it's a different party, to recognize the magnitude of the problem. And by then you're almost in the third year, and then
you have no time.
You can go after some of the kingpins, but going after kingpins is necessary, but not sufficient. And again, there's a resistance. Mexico, I think, understandably, has also always had, given our history, the history of our two countries, there's always been a bit of a reluctance to cooperate with the Yankees and to share everything and to have the kind of trust and confidence that is required. Although there are lots of examples of that. There are certain elements within Mexico that were vetted, that were absolutely trustworthy for working together with our most sensitive capabilities. I do think the trust and U.S. assistance is necessary, very much so, but it's difficult given the history, and it's difficult that you only have a 6-year term. It seems like a long period of time, but this would require continuity and commitment that would have to be sustained over multiple administrations. Colombia is not a good analogy because the powers of the central government are vastly greater than those of the federal government. In Mexico, because the police are directly under the Minister of Defense, so you have unity of effort when it comes to security, the willingness to accept U.S. support and huge amounts of helicopters and other material and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Nonetheless, that partnership was crucial to the crushing, really, of the FARC there, which unfortunately was not sustained in the enthusiasm over the reconciliation process, and where Colombia didn't recognize that there's no peace dividend for what they were going to carry out. with the peace initiative, they were going to have to actually move further out to take control of areas that used to be controlled by the FARC and also the ELN, although the ELN was not as enthusiastic, obviously, about that. So again, I am very cautious about the analogy being applicable, but there are some elements of it, even as you recognize that Mexico, much bigger, much more challenging, much less central authority, which could be exercised. And keep in mind that you had presidents that had 2 terms that were able to really break the back of the FARC. Now that's not a possibility in Mexico either. Now you only get a 4-year term and then you have to leave. You can run again, but in many cases, that's probably not likely.
General, just to have a mental model of, sort of the size of the beast, let's say, assuming that we had all the conditions to tackle organized crime in Mexico, how much time do you think that it would take a completely joint effort between the United States and Mexico if we were to do everything else right?
I think you have to be very conservative in that kind of assessment and say that it would take decades and it might even be many decades. But again, what you do is you start driving it down. I mean, look, we've never completely eliminated organized crime in the United States. So why would we think that we could do that? Not we, that the Mexicans could do it with our
Right.
assistance. But the question is, can you reduce it very dramatically? And that's the key, is to reduce the impact on ordinary Mexican citizens, which, as you noted, in some areas, in some cases, entire states, arguably, are in the grip of this, to varying degrees, and it's become part of the landscape. And the downside of that is, again, outside investment realizes this in a number of cases, and it's very, very problematic.
Yeah.
So, again, Mexico missing these extraordinary economic opportunities that are out there, and instead, the opportunity is going to end up in the United States. We'll find robots to do it
Or somewhere else in the world. General, let me take this conversation to the rest of Latin America because we are reading more and more about China becoming the number one trading partner of many countries in Latin America. Not Mexico, of course. Mexico, the U.S. is our largest trading partner, but also China. They're also a big source of investments, big source of lending. They're building infrastructure. They have now surveillance capabilities. They have close military ties with some governments in the region. Venezuela comes to mind. And, even the Russians, have a presence in Latin America. According to Northern Command, there are more Russian military personnel in the Mexican embassy now than at any other time in history. When we go back to our previous conversation and we talk about all these spinning plates, are you concerned that the United States has allowed has created a vacuum that allowed sort of China and Russia to sort of play a bigger role and have more influence in the area? And are you concerned? Should we be concerned? Is there anything that we could do to reverse this trend?
I am concerned. Some of this is just expansion of a growing superpowers activities around the world, not just in Latin America, but also very evident in Southeast Asia, Africa, and so forth. And some of that to be expected, some of it to be normal, and we should compete more effectively. So, what do we really need to do? We need to make Latin America less of an economy of force effort, pay more attention to it. It is our backyard. I think we are paying more attention to certain aspects of it, but most specifically just to immigration. It should be much more broadly applied than that. We need to compete more effectively. We need to figure out ways to de-risk. There have been initiatives by our government with investment firms. I was part of this in some respects, asking, hey, could you guys go invest in this country or that because they have incredible strategic minerals or what have you? And the answer generally is, please remember that we are not an arm of America's foreign policy. We love to do good, if you will, in U.S. national interest while doing well. But at the end of the day, again, we are investing other people's money and we have a responsibility to them in doing that. And that doesn't include investing in places where there is inadequate rule of law, insufficient security, overly cumbersome bureaucracy, corruption, malfeasance, you name it.
Look after your investors.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And there are parts of Latin America, just as there are major parts of Africa, they're just not investable, certainly not in terms of big deals. Don't get me wrong, there's always opportunity for smaller deals. But if you're a major investor in the world, KKR is one of those without question. Then there are certain threshold qualities and attributes that have to be present. And among those are rule of law, again, decent governance, security, decent bureaucracy, integrity, et cetera. And if those aren't present, it's difficult. So again, unlike China, where you have a huge government funded and led arm that is willing to overlook some of these issues, they're not as seized with a return on investment. They are seized on expanding influence, getting a foot in the door with technology, Huawei into the communications architecture, et cetera, access to ports and bases and so on. So it's a different system and a different approach, and we need to compete more effectively. Now, to be fair, the previous administration did increase they doubled the resources of the International Development Finance Corporation, but it's still only, I think, at roughly $60 billion assets under management. That's nowhere enough to do this. There are ways that they could de-risk activities of investment firms, but the creativity for that has not yet really come through. So this is a real conundrum for us, that our traditional manner of, again, investing in other countries is not capable of doing what the country would like to do in terms of competition. And so the government, I think, has to address that issue in some fashion, and it has not yet been able to do so.
General, before I let you go, let me ask you, of all the things that worry you and all these plates that are spinning that, sort of, I'm sure take a lot of your time and effort, what keeps you up at night?
Not much these days. I mean, again,
Thank God.
if you asked that when I was in one of my 5 General Officer Combat Commands or CI Director, plenty of things. But no, look, what concerns me again is just the sheer magnitude of challenges that we face, the urgent need for continued U.S. leadership, something that not all Americans agree is necessary, but I think very much is. And then the big challenge, which is that relationship between the U.S., like-minded nations, our partners and allies, and the People's Republic of China. And we have to ensure that relationship, which is one described as severe competition by our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, does not ever turn into actual conflict. That is the number one priority, I think, in the world, even as we do keep all these other plates spinning and need to do that, in my view, and can do it. We should seek efficiencies in certain ways. We're still struggling with a military industrial congressional complex that is overly invested in legacy systems rather than what we should be transitioning to, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of challenges, but I think this can be done. It comes down to effective U.S. leadership, vision, and so forth, and then working together with allies and partners to achieve our objectives.
Completely. And the fact that we've been clouded by this wave of populism in many, many countries certainly makes it even harder.
No question.
General, as you said, the U.S. needs effective leadership to deal with a very complicated world. And I would just close by saying that if Mexico wants to benefit from the global trends that you explained so eloquently, we will also need great leadership to create the conditions necessary to attract the nearshoring or friendshoring investments that are out there looking for a home. And for that to happen, Claudia and even her successor will have to tackle many, many challenges, from the rule of law to energy availability, and as important or more, crime. There will certainly be no Mexican miracle if we don't realize that we need to start curbing the power of these criminal empires, and that we need to start now because it will take many, many years. General, thank you so, so much for this brilliant, although scary conversation, but I hope you come back. You're always, always invited. Thank you.
Great to be with you again. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog